Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, March 2nd, 2026, and our dear friend and brother, Col Jacques Baud, is here with us. Welcome back, Col.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Hi to everybody.
Colonel, let me start with what is going on right now between the United States and Iran. We had Israeli American attack on Iranians, and in the initial hours, they assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, some commanders in Iran. And the attacks is somehow escalating the way that all bases, U.S. bases in the Middle East were hit. Some of them were in Bahrain, were obliterated, as Donald Trump likes this word. But the escalation is going beyond what it seems that Donald Trump had it in his mind, and it's getting Tel Aviv is getting hit, Tehran is getting a lot of attacks, and a lot of some parts are destroyed. You see, and there is some sort of total chaos when you look at what is happening right now. What is your understanding of of this conflict that is escalating?
Well, I think the problem, as we have seen in other conflicts, by the way, is the inability of the West to understand its adversary, to understand the posture of the adversary. You see, when we talk about what happened on Saturday and yesterday, uh, we just have to consider what happened before first to understand the position of Iranians. Early this year, you had, under the auspices of Russia, you had a dialogue established between Iran and Israel. And the idea was to have a kind of non-aggression pact to be signed by the two parties. And that was done by the Russian diplomacy, by the way. Later, we had earlier this month, I mean, the month of, not this month, but the previous one, February, we had the talks in Geneva with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. I mean, the first round, I mean, this round of negotiation in January were between Israel and Iran. And then in Geneva, you had the talks between the United States and Iran. We have seen on this occasion, and by the way, about the first round of talks, this was at the request of Israel. So Israel requested to have some kind of non-aggression agreement. As it comes to the talks with the US, we have seen that the US have systematically increased their demands and gone to the point where all the demands could not be fulfilled by the Iranians. I mean, asking to jeopardize literally their national security by abandoning ballistic missile and things like this. Reminding here people that the Iranian ballistic missiles are non-nuclear so far. And and therefore, if you look at this, and then you see what happened on Saturday, what would be your position as Iranian? You see, well, those guys, they ask us talk to improve the situation, to have some kind of dialogue, and then they take advantage of that to strike us. And they even strike us jointly because this was decided. I mean, this joint operation was decided in early February. I mean, on the 11th of February, as as Netanyahu was visiting Trump in Washington D.C. Meaning that even during the whole negotiation process, the Israelis and the Americans were planning an operation against Iran. But that means that from the Iranian perspective, how can you trust your partners? I mean, partners, not partners, but your counterparts. How can you trust them? They talk, they openly. I mean, they at face value, it's about peace and dialogue. but behind the scene, they are struggling to organize operations against you. So we are now in a situation where Iran has been struck by both countries. Um, as you said before, I mean, apparently there is a division of labor between the US and the Israelis. The Israelis are strike what is related to the leadership and the command and control system of the armed forces, including the guardian of the revolution. And the Americans strike the infrastructures, such as the nuclear infrastructure and things like this. So that's what looks like. Now, in the first day, you had already about 40 people of the Iranian leadership that had been killed, including Ali Khamenei. But not only. And that's very interesting, by the way, that the Israeli didn't miss the opportunity to keep their tradition alive and stroke a school in Tehran, killing 160 children. So we see that despite the narrative that they go on very precise, and they are able to do very precise strikes, but those precise strikes also strike children, as we have seen in Palestine. So we have something here that, by the way, no media in the West have reported. I've seen yesterday the report of the Belgian TV. They have spoken about the 9 people who were killed as a result of the Iranian retaliation in Tel Aviv, but there was no single word about the 160 school children who have been killed in Tehran. So Iran now is in a position that it cannot really trust people, even for talks, for a dialogue, for a diplomatic action. And but this also must be added to the fact that we had in the previous 2 years, we had several attempts, attacks, not attempts, attacks from Israel to Iran, attacking individuals in Iran. And therefore, the Iranians at this stage know that if they stop their retaliation or their response, and if you have a ceasefire or some kind of appeasement in that, that will only serve the purpose of rearming Israel and the US. So they know that they are condemned to strike stronger and stronger. In fact, Iran is put in a position that it has to escalate to some extent. And that's the tragic of the situation, because there is no way Iran can now trust any diplomatic initiative coming from the US. And the US is the only discussion or dialogue partner you can have. Israel is no partner at all. Europe is inexistent diplomatically. The US was the only power that was more or less willing to talk to the Iranians. But even that, we saw that it was just an exercise in duplicity by the Americans. So now, who can you trust? The only way is to bring the conflict to the point that both Israel and the US will have to beg for peace. That's where we are. And that's because the Iranian cannot trust any peace or dialogue initiative coming from the US. From the Israeli, we can probably forget that. But so we are in a very tragic situation. Iran is a country that has much bigger resources than we think. Um, and it is probably able and resilient enough to sustain, let's say, some kind of attrition war, let's put it that way, because their resources are not infinite. Their ability to fight is probably not infinite. The number of missiles they have, or drones, or whatever, is not infinite. But probably they have prepared for such a situation. And my understanding of the way of Iran think about this situation is that Iran has planned for such a protracted war against the US and Israel. On the other hand, the US, in fact, has failed in his first attempt to overthrow the regime. It has killed Ali Khamenei, but it's not killing the leader is not overthrowing the regime, and that's very important to understand that. And why do I say it failed? It failed because the Americans and the Israelis, because obviously let's say the obvious objective of the whole operation was precisely to have this regime change. But to have a regime change, the problem is that the assumption of the West in general, and the US and Israel in particular, was that the Iranian population hate the regime. And I've seen also some journalists in Switzerland saying that 80% of the population is ready to overthrow the regime, because in fact the whole Iran just holds because of a small elite that keeps the power. And I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Iranian society, the Iranian system, and Iran as a country functions. And the problem is that when we see, and then we have seen in January all these demonstration protests and things like this, uh, what the media fail to say is that all these pictures or movies that we see come from some cities, and very often large cities, but they may not be replicated in other parts of the country. And that's something that I noticed in during the riots that you had in 2009. When I started to study these riots across the country, I noticed that in fact those riots were concentrated just on a few cities, but the main part of the country didn't feel the need of having any kind of revolt and things like this. And so our perception of the Iranian society is false, and has probably led Trump and his advisors that if you just give a small impulsion to the opposition, the whole country would then erupt in a kind of a revolution and then change the regime. And it's very fascinating, because uh, if I were someone who would plan for regime change, I would certainly not have done what the Americans have done. Remember, you had those riots in January that were largely sponsored by the US, and even the US confessed that through economic measures and monetary measures. They create a situation where you had some ground for dissatisfaction in the Iranian population. And then you remember all these the episode of the Starlink terminals that were smuggled into Iran in order to create some kind of networks, in order to foster a revolution. So they did that in January. But apparently, this was kept under control by the government. Again, I'm not discussing the number of casualties. I think that here we are in the range of things that are between disinformation and propaganda. There have been certainly some casualties, there's no doubt, but certainly in the size that were reported in our media. In any case, somehow the government managed to keep the whole thing under control. And then in February, we didn't talk about these riots anymore. And suddenly, at the end of the month, comes this strike. In fact, if you would do a real regime change, you would have done exactly the opposite. You would have combined both the military strike and then some riots in order to take the opportunity of the because when you change the leadership, even if it was prepared as it was in Iran, because based on the experience of the previous strikes of last year, the 12 days war, Iran prepared for a situation in which the leadership would be eliminated, and then you had to put in place a new leadership. And for that reason, Iran prepared this transition for months. That means that probably all decisions that were taken by the leader in the one who was in charge, but probably all decisions were shared with the second in command, if you want, who was planned as to take over in case of the killing of the person in charge. So, meaning that Iran prepared this transition, but nevertheless, regardless if this transition is smooth or not, whether it's rapid or, or slow, a transition is always a moment of weakness. And that's the moment the Americans should have used to then destabilize the government with riots and all that. This didn't happen. This didn't happen. They sequenced in the operations, in my view, in a completely wrong way. As a result, I think this regime change has not happened. You had a change of the leaders, but not a regime change. The problem in such a situation, and that's something that I've studied in many in many articles that I've written on the issue, is when you start killing leaders, the danger is that you don't know who will be next. You know those who are in charge, but you don't know who will come after them. And therefore, when you start killing the leaders, you put yourself in a situation of uncertainty as how these new leaders will react and how they will respond to the situation. Very often, and that's the experience that I've looked at in, for instance, in Palestine with the Hamas. Each time Israel has killed a Palestinian leader, the next one was always someone who was more, let's say, more tough. It was always a tougher person, while they killed people who were ready to, they were open to dialogue, but the one who replaced was no longer ready for dialogue and was much more in favor of a tougher stance. So, meaning that by killing leaders, you degrade your own situation. And that's something that I described in my book on asymmetric warfare, because that's exactly how I define asymmetric warfare. It's a situation in which each move you make in order to improve your situation, in fact, degrades your own situation. And that's exactly what we have seen with in Palestine for years with Israel, and they do exactly the same with Iran. When you start killing leaders, then you have the risk of having more effective, more aggressive, and more efficient and more dynamic younger leaders. And that's probably what we'll have. Therefore, Israel and the US have, in fact, degraded their own strategic posture in that. So that's how I see that. That's the reason why I have the feeling that uh, Iran is now obliged to escalate the conflict up to the point where Iran and the US have no other choice than begging for peace. And not for ceasefire, but for peace. And my personal view, if I were Iranian, I would certainly do in a strategy, a harder strategy, but beyond the point where Israel and US would ask for peace. You have to go beyond that point because you have to make sure that it's not just that they want peace, but they need peace. And that's where that's the situation in which we are. I don't know. I'm not in the Iranian leadership, but as I understand from what I've seen so far, the Iranian leadership, generally speaking, without going into the specifics, because we don't know the new leaders, but I assume they are in the same vein as the others, they think in a very strategic way. And my feeling, because apparently Trump has already made some indications that he would start a discussion, and Iranians have said no. So my feeling is that the Iranians tend to think a little bit, just as I explained, that they feel that we need to go now further than during the 12-day wars, the 12 days war, and we need to go even beyond the point where Israel and the US ask for peace. And that's a little bit the situation where we are. This will be that will cost a lot, many lives, but I think there's no choice, because the problem is that both, when we talk about this war between Iran and US, Iran and Israel, we are in a kind of war that is not rational. Everybody knows that Iran has no claims towards Israel. I mean, there's no territorial claims, there's no economic claims, there is no objective reason for having a war between the US and Iran and Iran and Israel. We are in a war that is driven by obsession. We have heard this from for years now. I mean, it's about 50 years in the US. They want to take Iran down, period. They don't care who is in the power, regardless of who it is. They were, in fact, what happened in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the departure of the Shah was extremely humiliating for the Americans. And they never, and you had other aspects, such as the occupation of the US Embassy by the students and the Guardians of Revolution in just after the revolution, and that was a huge humiliation for the Americans, and they never forgot that, and that is driving, sorry, this obsession against Iran. And therefore, in such a situation, from an Iranian point of view, you cannot expect the Americans to come back to some rationality. And the same with Israel. Why is Israel suddenly, in the years 2005 or something like that, Israel started to designate Iran as an enemy? I mean, this is just out of nowhere. There is no rational explanation for that. It's just obsessive, and therefore you need now to bring them to their knees. This is the only way, because if you make any kind of ceasefire with them, they will come back, and we have seen that in the last 2 years. We have seen that the Israelis have come, I mean, regularly, systematically, they will come back and trying to strike Iran in some way. So there is no way you can talk to them rationally. You have to bring them really down so that they have no other choice than asking for peace. That's my personal view.
Yeah. Carl, we see the Arab states in the Persian Gulf being hit by Iranian missiles, and they were somehow behind the scene. It seems, as Bernie Sanders came out, he tweeted that both Israel and Saudi Arabia brought this war, and they convinced Donald Trump to go that far. I don't know how accurate is his, understanding of what's going on, but it seems that the calculation on the part of Iranian is getting the same way, and they're not. They started with the American bases, and right now they don't let the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and they cannot use the Strait of Hormuz. How do you see, the calculation on the part of the Arab states, and how the United, because the Saudi Arabia is saying that many people in their media saying that the United States abandoned us. They're just helping Israel. They're just defending Israel, and nobody's defending us. What is your understanding of what has happened in that direction so far?
Well, first of all, I think that the Americans had no real interest for the Arab states whatsoever. They just used them as as how to say that, as a point for deployment of U.S. bases in the region. Period. That was a way of controlling the region to some extent. Saudi Arabia is probably a particular case because it has a specific, a particular relationship with the U.S., tracing back to the Second World War, and there is also, let's say, there are economic interests, there are financial interests, and there is probably some kind of, let's say, cultural ties. Not cultural; it's not the right word, but let's say political, or let's say the relationship between the royal family and the U.S. has always been something extremely. You remember what we said about the when you had the 9/11. This very strange relationship between the Saudis and the U.S. government, and I think that's part of the picture in some to some extent. What we have seen in this particular case is apparently, I say apparently because I have no way to confirm these reports, but that the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, had been calling many times Trump to support the idea of striking Iran. On the other hand, you may remember 2 years ago when you had these encounter between the leaders of Iran and MBS in Saudi Arabia. That was, everybody thought it was a departure of a new era of the relationship within the Middle East. I don't know exactly where we have to put the Saudis in that picture. It seems that they depend very much on U.S. funding, and that's the same for other small Arab states. They are extremely dependent on the U.S., and the U.S. is using them. In fact, the real ally of the region is Israel, and the others are only in support of that the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Period. And I think, as a matter of fact, that these Arab states were used as a buffer zone between Iran and Israel, if I can simplify a little bit the picture. But it's interesting that none of these Arab states opposed the use of their base on their territory to strike Iran. No, none of them opposed the use of the airspace to bomb Iran. So there is also a duplicity among the Arab states. And we have seen that, by the way, we are talking about Iran today, but you can apply exactly the same kind of observation regarding Palestine. A very strange behavior of the Arab states there. Well, they uh, obviously you could say that traditionally, culturally, they would support the Palestinians, but in fact they don't. They prefer to support the Americans, and we can understand why, because the U.S. has this huge military power. It has already completely destroyed Iraq, completely destabilized the region, and that would be very easy to destabilize a country such as Saudi Arabia, for instance. Remember that you have a lot of people in Saudi Arabia who are Shia, especially in the area close to Kuwait and on the Persian Gulf. A lot of Shia, very strong Shia minority. So it would be very easy to destabilize these countries. These countries. Most of these countries have a state structure which is based on a tribal structure, meaning that it's very easy to break this tribal balance by funding. And that's exactly what the Americans are trying, and the French are trying to do in Iran, by the way. This is exactly that, because you have the same issue in Iran to a different extent, but nevertheless, you have those different ethnic groups you may call tribe or ethnic groups. Nevertheless, these groups may have diverging interests and things like this. So it's easy to bribe them and to use them to destabilize the country. I mean, so what's happening, or what the West is trying to do in Iran, could be done easily in Saudi Arabia. They have done that in Iraq, by the way. Iraq is it's not just what happened in 2003, but it's the result of a constant destabilization efforts since the early 90s up to 2003, and that was all supported by the US, mostly the US, a little bit by the British, but it was mostly the US. So and that's exactly what happened in Syria, by the way. You have exactly the same thing. So those countries are fragile in essence because they have been created as a result of decolonization process, combining different ethnic groups that may. I mean, Iran is a little bit different in that context because it has escaped that phase, if you want. But the rest, what we call the Levant, are in fact the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, and then the French Empire, and then the British Empire that just after World War One shared these the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So, and all that was done without consultation of the local population. That's exactly what we see in Palestine, by the way. But the fact of the matter is that you have a relative stability, but also a relative instability. That's what you see in Lebanon. That's what you see in Palestine. That's what you have seen in Syria. That's what you can see very easily in areas such as Jordan, for instance, but also in other countries. So, meaning that these countries are vulnerable, they know it, and therefore they rely on the support of the US for their own stability. And for that reason, they are very keen in supporting the US, whatever they do, even if they think that it's not for the sake of peace. So that's a little bit the problem. So yes, that's what we can say. The problem is that now these countries start to realize that their gain of being the ally of the US is not so much, because now they are being sacrificed by the Americans just for the sake of protecting Israel. And that can be understood no, probably not right now, but probably in the midterm or short midterm, by those countries are probably changing their alliances, because we see that is being allied of the West is just creating new problem. When you have US bases on your territory, essentially you attract missiles on your territory, if I can put it very simply. So with such allies, it's better to have an enemy. You see? So what's the point having such an ally? And that's probably, I don't know. Again, I don't have any crystal ball, but we may expect some changes in the future in terms of who should we trust. You see that you cannot trust the Americans. I mean, if the Americans can do some kind of diplomatic dialogue and at the same time prepare war against you, that means that you cannot trust these persons. You cannot trust the Americans. So that's obvious for Iran today, but that could be the case for Syria tomorrow, or Saudi Arabia or Jordan. The Americans are extremely pragmatic. And if they want to satisfy their own obsessions, they will just dump you, and that's it. So it's not the US and the West at large, or Europe is very similar, by the way, are not reliable partners. We can see that also with Europe, because you remember that European countries, Germany, France, UK, and the European Union, by the way, were also signatories of the JCPOA. And after Iran complied with the JCPOA and asked for the relief of the sanctions, as planned in the JCPOA, then the US withdrew from the treaty, and the others, and namely the Europeans, were so afraid of the US that they didn't relieve the sanctions. So again, you have the West in this region. The West has a history of um, of cheating, a history of non respecting their own word. So why would you then have more relationship with those countries if you know that they will dump you at the first occasion? So again, I think unfortunately this happens to your country, Iran, but at the same time, it's probably something that reveals the true nature of the West, in general terms. And that's also something, in my view, that will affect the perception of the Europeans and the Americans in the long run for a very long time, because people will notice that the Europeans and the West at large is unreliable. You cannot trust them, even if you have signed something with them, even if you have a dialogue with them, even if they look like friends. They will never be your friends, and that will remain. This picture will remain. In the Middle East, it's very interesting to see how long the perception of the Crusades have lasted in the region. When the Crusaders came in 1,000 years ago, to wage war in the Middle East, and this memory is still there. Today, the means are different, but in fact, who has destabilized the Middle East in the last 30 years? The West. For what reason? No reason. No reason. All was based on lies. All was based on fake information, disinformation. I mean, you name it. But the result is a very tangible. I mean, the result is not fake. The result is that you have a completely destabilized region. You have countries that have been completely dislocated, divided, in faction, that are still opposing. Look at Syria, for instance, without solving any problem. Look, just as simple, the problem of the Kurds have not been solved, for instance. The problem of Palestine has not been solved, on the contrary. So what is the benefit of the West in this region? They just bring chaos and distraction, and they don't help to build something new. Although we could argue that if you think about it, it would be very beneficial for the West to have good relation with the Middle East. I mean, after all, it's an area that has a lot of resources. It's an area that would benefit from the development and technology from the West. So we could see synergies here. We could see complementarity. We could see a lot of commonalities. But the West is still refusing that. So we are condemned in this kind of confrontation, and Iran today is just the symbol of that, if I can put it that way.
Colonel, before the war breaking out, there were a lot of misinformation, disinformation that's saying that supreme leader of Iran has just is in a tunnel and he went to Russia to. Then you see when the attack comes, as they knew that the attack is coming, he was in his office having a meeting, and his granddaughter was in the building with his family. He didn't. He was just doing the, his work in his office. And while you see, on the other hand, you see Netanyahu is just flying to Greece, then to Germany. He's not in. You know, it's unbelievable the level of misinformation and disinformation when it comes to the behavior of the people. I think for many people in Iran, when they see their leader was killed in his office while working, and it shows how the behavior of the government, the people of Iran, would be to respond to such an aggression from the United States and Israel, and how the behavior of Israeli government is, as we see in Netanyahu.
Well, it's a very interesting observation you make here. Remember that Israel is not a Middle East country; it's a European country. There is no Israeli who comes from the region, or probably a very tiny minority. Most of the Israelis come from Europe, period. This is not, even if they claim to be here since 2000 years, this is just nothing. In reality, they come from Europe. They have a European mentality. They have European names that they just change to make them sound like Israelis. But in fact, these people are not from the region. They don't understand the people of the region. They don't understand the cultures. They have never understood how the Palestinians think because they are not able to do that. They are immigrants, basically. And it's very interesting because when we talked about previously about this the idea of regime change in Iran, and it's very clear that you can say that the Americans have never understood exactly the dynamics, the psychology of the individuals in the Middle East at large. Even if the Iranians are Shia and the others are Sunni, there are some commonalities in the Islamic thinking. And I think when you talk about the this episode of Ali Khamenei killed at his desk, working calmly, not being hiding into a tunnel or so, it's also a matter of dignity. Means that he is killed in his office. He's not killed hiding like a rat somewhere. You see, that's very important. But it's also more important, something that the West fails to understand. And because I've been involved in the resolution of some conflict with where you had obviously Muslim fighters, um, we have to understand the way people understand war and where how they understand the the idea of victory in the Middle East. In the West, as I have learned in my military school, victory is understood as the destruction of the enemy. Basically, it's when you talk about victory, is a victory of yourself towards someone else. So you crush the enemy, you destroy the enemy. That's your victory. For a Muslim, the victory is not related to the destruction of the enemy. Is related to the fact that you should not give up. Victory is not a victory over the enemy. Victory is a victory over yourself. Not to abandon the fight, not to give up. And it doesn't mean that we need to destroy the enemy to be victorious for a Muslim. But failing to fight, failing to keep the head high, that would be a defeat. The defeat is when you give up. That's when you don't defend yourself, when you don't defend what you think is right, and things like that. So the idea of and by the way, this is exactly the significance, the signification, the meaning of jihad. Jihad doesn't mean a holy war or things like that. This is a Western translation. It's not the translation. Translation is to struggle, to resist. That's the essence of jihad, the ability to resist. And that's essentially an individual posture. It's an intellectual posture, not to give up to the enemy, but to be firm and to say, well, we'll withstand that. And that's exactly what you have with Ali Khamenei. By the way, there is another aspect that is very strong in the military thinking in the Muslim, is the importance of intent rather than to effect. So, and that explains, by the way, why you have a lot of, when you arrest a terrorist, he will accuse himself of a lot of crimes, even if he didn't do them. He didn't did them, because the importance is what you wanted to do, is not what you did. Because the idea is that you may have an enemy that is stronger than you. It might be that the enemy has a weapon stronger than yours. So you wanted to achieve an objective and you cannot do it because your adversary is too strong for that. And you cannot be blamed for not having the stronger weapon, but you could be blamed for not wanting to defeat your enemy. You can be blamed for not wanting to resist the enemy, whatever his strength is. And that's exactly how we should understand the way Muslims at large react to wars. And that explains why you have an extremely strong resilience in Muslim societies. You see that in Palestine, by the way, exactly the same. And that's exactly what you see in Iran. And the idea of a leader that has prepared everything, who said, well, it's not myself. My person is not important. What is important is the collectivity, is the community, is the state at large, not my person. It's the system that is important, not the individual. And that's exactly what this the killing of Ali Khamenei demonstrates. And that's the reason why you have so strong reaction of respect when he was killed. I mean, beyond the fact that he was also a religious leader and a spiritual leader and all these aspects. But beyond this, it's also the one who showed the way. You know, we have prepared things. We are ready to defend ourselves. But I will not fail to do that. I'm doing my work as every day. I'm not afraid of the enemy. If he kills me, but the system will take over and the system will continue. And that's exactly why to some extent, this understanding of war that you have in a Muslim world is a little bit more holistic than the Western one. And that explains why societies can better survive wars in the Middle East than they can in the West. And that explains also why you may have, even if you have opposition movements in Iran, both ethnic, monarchists, you have, you name it, you have a lot of different opposition movement. But as long as they are united by the same faith and the same kind of belief, they can understand this kind of posture. And instead of creating division, I mean, in Europe, you would create division. In Europe, the tactics that were used by the Israelis and the Americans could perfectly work in France, for instance, but not in Iran. The same tactics will fail in Iran. In France, it would perfectly, because this is exactly the kind of society that will split as soon as the leader has been killed. We have seen that during the French Revolution, by the way. And that's why the French Revolution had to be so bloody, because you had to fight against those who took advantage of the situation to fight each other, and so on and so forth. In any case, we have here a society, a mindset, a philosophy. As I prefer use the word in English, in German, Weltanschauung, an understanding of the world that is different in the Middle East. And as long as you don't understand that, you cannot defeat them. You know, it's a iron rule of warfare. If you don't understand your enemy, there is no chance for you to win. And the principle, the main weakness of the Israelis and of the Americans is that they fail to understand their enemies. They are so arrogant. They feel that they are the model. They are the ones that held the truth. And therefore, they don't even try to understand how the other think. And that's exactly the recipe to lose. And we have seen that in Palestine, by the way. You had this massive Israeli army, allegedly the most powerful army in the Middle East. And they did achieve a single objective that they assigned, that they assigned themselves in October 2023. They killed a lot of people, they killed some leaders, but they didn't achieve the objective. And that's exactly the problem. In addition to that, killing the leader is a very primitive way of understanding things. Again, this is something that work if you have a Western army, well structured and all that. If you kill the chief or the chiefs or the commandants, probably you may create a weakness that allow yourself to create to achieve victory. But again, killing the chiefs or the commandant without following up with a new operation afterwards, this means nothing. It's just killing for killing. And that's exactly what we have in Iran. The Ayatollah has been killed, now there will be another one. And so what? Israel will kill the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and for what? So it's killing for the fun of killing. Normally, I would say for the sake of killing, but with Israeli, I say for the fun, because they have fun in killing people, as we have seen in Palestine when soldiers said that they had the fun killing children in Palestine. So we have here a very a huge cultural difference that at first glance seems to be in favor of Israel and the US because they killed Khamenei and other leaders. But if you look a little bit deeper, you will see that in fact they have achieved nothing. They killed individuals, they can claim it in the media, but they haven't destroyed the system. They have not been able to destabilize the system. On the contrary, they have created an incentive for more stronger, ruthless reply or response from Iran. And that will happen exactly. I mean, again, I have no crystal ball. I can only assume. But in the 12 days war, we had exactly that. The Israelis started, and finally, they were the ones begging for a ceasefire because they saw that, in fact, the Iranians were too strong compared to what they can do. And remember, they claimed their Iron Dome and their technology and all that, and all that didn't work. And today we see exactly the same thing. Even during the first day of the war, the first response from Iran, already you can see that the Iranian missiles go through the Iron Dome and go through the theater air defense system provided by the US, can go through the Patriot defense in some military bases across the Middle East. So, meaning that the Iranians have found a way to go to bypass the so-called Western technology or the Western technological superiority, I would say, so assumed superiority. But so we are now again, everything is based on a false assumption, a false perception of the conflict. And that's the biggest mistake you can do. And that's exactly what I've said about the Ukrainian conflict. It's nice to say, well, the Russians are weak and all that. It's nice in the media. But the reality, the fact of the matter is that what counts is what happens in reality. Whatever you claim is what you claim, but the reality decides at the end of the day. That's exactly what we have now. And now we are surprised, after having said that the Iranian regime is despised by its population, that the Iranian people is ready to overthrow the government. None of this happened. And now we are surprised by this because the first attack or the strikes were not designed for a long war, a long protracted war. It was designed for a short war. And the first strike, and the US expected that this first strike would trigger something, but it didn't. Therefore, they are condemned. They are dragged into a more protracted war that they are not prepared for. As a result, they will lose. I mean, I don't know if they will lose, but they will certainly not be they will certainly not reach the objective that I've said before.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.